Also, interestingly, Muhammad ibn Ka'b al-Quradi, the great Sahabis, he says that, in one of the great Mufassirs of the Quran also, he says that the greatest of all worship is to give up sins. That's why the ulama also, they say that first of all, before attending to, or as a prerequisite for the offering of worship, then one has to purify oneself from sins. Otherwise, it's like pouring milk into a cup of urine or some other sort of najasat. So similarly, as Tawheed is first of all the negation of any partner to Allah or any attribution to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then affirmation of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to abstain from sins is the greatest of all, righteous actions, and therefore the ulama of Saluk, they're very, they focus a lot on ensuring that their students would first of all give up sins and abstain from sin, and then focus on the acts of worship. Fudail ibn Iyad, also one of the great ulama, great scholars, pious people of our aslaf, he says, the lighter that you take a sin to be, the greater it becomes in the sight of Allah. So sometimes we're doing things and we don't give them the due importance. Taking it lightly, that itself is a major sin. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha wrote to Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala anhu something basically to this effect, that that person who disobeys Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his fans will become his fault finders. Those people who are celebrating his praises, they'll turn into, Allah will change their hearts and make them, the criticizers. And he will turn the friends into the enemies. Similarly, the Prophet ﷺ mentions a very famous hadith that when a person commits a sin, a black dot comes onto the heart. If istighfar, tawbah are performed, as we mentioned earlier, that black dot is cleaned. Otherwise, it remains, and then further sins, more black dots, further sins, more blackness, until the heart becomes totally blackened. And then it doesn't know right from wrong, and it's also mentioned as the ran, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seals up the hearts with. So the continuous performance of sins darkens the heart, and so therefore, after a while, people don't even see sin as sin. And this is what we see the world basically, the condition of most of the people in the world today. So as for the definition of major sin, so now how do we define a major sin from a minor sin? So the ulama mentioned that one of the ways that we can define, or we can differentiate, is that if there is a sin which has a specific prescribed punishment in the world, then that is definitely a major sin, like drinking, fornication, etc., killing, and all of these things. They have a prescribed punishment in this world that indicates major sin. Also, if there's a specific promise of a punishment in the hereafter, or there's the mention of the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and who does such and such, this is also indicating a major sin. Also, if there's a sin which has an outcome, as we mentioned, it has an impact on others or on oneself to the extent of a major sin, that will also be a major sin. And also, a person who does sins rebelliously, that in itself is a major sin. Or the person who does small sins and makes it his habit, he's continually doing the small sins, but he makes it his habit, that is also a major sin. Someone said to Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas, we heard that the major sins are 7. He said, to 700 is probably more correct. So they're not, So then that takes us to the fact that Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam has mentioned in a hadith 3 things, 5, 7, a few things. He hasn't mentioned so many things. And as we mentioned, just like when he was asked what is the best action, what are the greatest, virtuous activities, so various responses came from Rasulullah, and similarly responding to the major sins, looking at the circumstance, the person, and the circumstances involved. So Nabi ﷺ would give various, definitions and various guidance towards that. And among the things which Nabi ﷺ has mentioned, that in one of the hadith, very famous hadith of Sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim, he says, I warn you of these major sins. Number one, to aspire to attribute any partner to Allah subhanahu, which is the sin of all sins. Secondly, disobedience of parents. And lastly, qawl al-zur, and false witness. And he kept up repeating it again and again and again. So probably there was some context that warranted the focus on this, false witness. Also, killing one's child, like we do today. People, they have these abortions, even sometimes when the fetus has actually become a human being. And there's no question among the ulama that this is totally haram. That's the killing of a human being. Once the human being passed 4 months, the ruh has come into that human being, that fetus, he becomes a human being. So this abortion is killing that. So this amounts to killing your children. And why? For the fear that they will be, taking rizq away from you. And yurzaqu mak. There's going to be competition between their rizq and your rizq. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from such things. Also, Nabi Sallallahu very interesting mentioned a major sin to curse your parents. So now, in these days, that's quite open, directly. But in those days, no one could imagine doing such a thing. So somebody asked, Ya Rasulullah, how does somebody curse their parents? He says that somebody curses someone else's parents, and then that person curses his parents. So it's as though he has cursed his own parents by perpetuating or initiating, that process. False accusations, deserting the companions in the battlefield, living in a country of disbelievers, which is kind of scary for us, particularly leaving the countries of Muslims or Islamic country and coming to a non-Muslim country and living with them after hijrah. Now, of course, that needs some elucidation. Now, what is referred to that is a country where they are at war with Muslims, and one cannot follow his deen, and therefore blends back into that society. Hopefully, those of us living in these countries, that doesn't apply, inshallah, hopefully, provided we remain on the deen and propagate our deen. Also, magic is a major sin. Holding back water, as we mentioned in the hadiths. When you have excess water and you're holding back water from others who need it. And drinking, of course, sharab and alcoholic beverages and all these intoxicants is mentioned as the mother of all evils, because once you're intoxicated, you don't know what you're doing and anything can happen. Joining two prayers together without an excuse. There's not a journey or there's not a sickness or whatever shari excuse, and like people just laziness. Two salats performed together. This is also a major sin. Losing hope in the mercy of Allah is also a major sin. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Rahman and Rahim and we lose hope, this is also a major sin. To bring loss to an inheritor or reduce his share, we talked about inheritance previously, there's also